Good evening. Thank you all for being here tonight. My name is Han Han, President of the Arts and Sciences Alumni Board at Boston University, and I'd like to welcome you tonight to the second installment of the Arts and Sciences Discoveries Learning and Lecture Series. Tonight's topic, What Would Thoreau Think? Global Warming at Walden Pond, will be presented by Richard Primack, Professor of Biology at Boston University. Now, before we proceed with tonight's program, I'd like to ask everybody to please turn off all electronic devices, as tonight's program is being recorded and the quality of the recording may be affected by any devices that you may have on. So thank you for your understanding. I'd also like to take this opportunity to thank one of my fellow board members, Wes Mott, for organizing tonight's lecture. Wes was very instrumental in reaching out to Professor Primack for this event, and we're very grateful and appreciative of Wes's efforts to ensure the event's success. I'd also like to take this moment to introduce to you an important member of the arts and sciences community. After spending the past 31 years as a faculty member at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, which also included serving in several leadership positions, this individual arrived at Boston University in July 2007 as the Dean of Arts and Sciences, where her vision and leadership has already made a significant impact in the Boston University community. Now, in addition to serving as a dean, she is also a faculty member in the political science department, a fact that I just wanted to share with everybody, as I'm sure it is not very commonly known. But I'm proud to introduce to you tonight the Dean of Arts and Sciences, Virginia Shapiro.
Thank you, Han Han. I am delighted to be able to be here. As he said, I've not yet finished my first year as Dean of the College of Arts and Sciences, but one of the things that's really been terrific over the course of this year is really to get to know the BU community. And by that I include our faculty, our students, our staff, and of course our alumni. And I've spent really a tremendous amount of time trying to get around the country and see different people go out into the community. So I've met some of you. I'm looking forward to meeting many, many more of you, because you remain very, very important parts of Boston University. This Discovery Series is a very important one that allows us to give the alumni a deeper look into issues that affect the world and affect all of our lives. We use some of the astounding depth and breadth of knowledge that's created by the faculty of BU to share with our friends, our alumni, the members of our community, and to help all of us continue our education throughout our lives. As we say here with respect to our alumni, in terms of your education, your graduation is only a beginning. Let me say here, before I introduce our speaker, that there is a light reception following the talk. Now, surely Walden Pond is the iconic landscape for thinking about our environment and how our relationship to the natural world shape who we are and who we can be. Walden is an even more compelling image for those of us who live so close by, and I'm happy to return back to this region. I was therefore thrilled that tonight's lecture will focus on Walden Pond as a means for exploring crucial issues about our natural environment and its future. We are so fortunate to have on our faculty Richard Primack, a professor of biology. Professor Primack is single-handedly an example of how much Boston University has come to be a truly global university. Indeed, as I looked over information about him to decide what to say in my introduction, I began to wonder whether we actually have more than one Richard Primack on our faculty, because his work is so diverse and he has explored so many different places. I don't know how he appears in all those different places at once. There's the Primack who's a tropical biologist traveling off to Malaysia and India, president of the Association for Tropical Biology, and author of a recent book on tropical rainforests. There's another Primack who is a conservation biologist. This one is the author of textbooks in conservation biology, which have been translated into 20 languages, and is the editor-in-chief of the international journal Biological Conservation. And most recently, we seem to have yet another Professor Primack who is studying the effects of global warming on the plants and birds of Massachusetts. Now, of course, then there's actually another one who won a prestigious Guggenheim Fellowship and spent a year at the University of Tokyo. So clearly, you couldn't be in all of these different places if you're only one person. Professor Primack joined our faculty in 1978 after earning his BA in biology, magna cum laude, from Harvard, and his PhD in botany from Duke University. At BU, he's taught a wide variety of courses, including introductory biology, botany, ecology, and conservation biology. His recent work with BU graduate students and undergraduates has been widely covered in the media, most notably in the Smithsonian Magazine and recently in an AP article picked up by newspapers across the country. In his main current work, he uses Concord, Massachusetts as a living laboratory to determine which species of plants are the most sensitive indicators of climate change and how invasive species affect our plant communities. The connections between Thoreau's observations at Walden and modern observations have provided an example of global warming right here in our own backyard that can be widely appreciated. Therefore, please join me in welcoming Professor Primack to share with us some of his work.
Thank you very much, Dean Spiro, for that introduction. I think you put my work in a very nice context, almost I think better than I could have. I almost invite you to give the lecture instead of me. It's a pleasure to be here tonight and share with you some of the work which we've been doing. And as Dean Spiro says, is that the work which we've been doing is quite a departure from the kind of work which we were doing prior to 5 years ago. And the way this happened is interesting, that I write textbooks in the field of conservation biology. And in 1992, there was this one tiny section about global warming. And it was a very speculative section with a few references. And every 2 years, I revised one of my textbooks. And this section on global warming kept getting bigger and bigger and bigger. And I was struck by the fact about 5 years ago, when I did the latest revision, that very few of the examples came from the Eastern United States. Most of the examples seemed very far away. They were from about polar bears or frogs in Costa Rican mountains, or they were from European plants. There weren't any really good examples from the Eastern United States or even from the Western United States. They all were examples far away. And so I began wondering whether we could find examples of the effects of global warming, or the effects of climate change in the Eastern United States and specifically in Massachusetts. And I was pretty sure that if we looked in the Boston area, we could find examples of old records of when plants flowered or birds arrived or something like that, that we could see whether they were still the same today. And so I proposed this to, at that time, my graduate student, Abe Miller-Rushing, and the undergraduates who were working for me, if they were interested in seeing if we could find the effects of global warming right around us. And they agreed to do this. And so for the last 5 years, we've been undergoing this investigation of how much evidence we can find. And the talk which I'm giving today, I mean, it was billed as a talk by myself, but this is actually a talk, it's all work done jointly by Abe Miller-Rushing, who's in the audience today. Actually, Abe, raise your hand. Come on, raise your hand. So this is all work done jointly. And Abe recently got his PhD for this work, for parts of this work. And sometimes he gives this talk, sometimes I give the talk. Actually, a lot of times we give the talk together, where we kind of alternate paragraphs. And it's also work done by lots of Boston University undergraduates, some of whom are in this room, actually many of whom are in this room tonight, and some of whom have graduated and moved on to other activities. So it's really a joint effort of a whole community of people at Boston University. And I'll mention them by name at the end of the talk. And so this is really an investigation of our ability to find information which relates to this topic of global warming and see if we can find evidence for it in this region in a way that people can relate to. Find examples right around us. And this shows us with our third sort of collaborator, which is Thoreau, because what we discovered right early in this investigation was that Thoreau had kept very detailed records of when plants were flowering in Concord. And so we always thought that we were working with Thoreau, and we actually at one point contemplated having Thoreau as a co-author on all of our papers, which would probably have increased the attention that they received in the media. We found that this was not really possible to include Thoreau as a co-author, but it was a thought. But we did rely very heavily on his records. So the first thing that we wanted to know is what is happening? What is the evidence that we could find for signatures of climate change? And the first thing that we went looking for were old flowering records, so when plants flowered in the past, and we found that Thoreau had kept these very detailed nature calendars in the 1850s around Walden Pond. We were looking for bird records, anything we could find. One thing which we've been looking for the last 6 years are records of when butterflies emerge or when bees start flying in the spring, when you start seeing tiger beetles. And in all the 6 years we've been searching, we've never found any information about when insects become active in the spring. Interestingly enough, we recently have come across records of when Walden Pond thawed in Thoreau's time and when it thaws now, when the ice-out time is. And we can see that the ice-out times are getting earlier every spring. So we keep expanding the kind of range of information that we're getting about the effects of climate change. But why should we care about this? I mean, is it really important to know when plants are flowering in the spring, if they're flowering a little bit earlier or later? Does this matter? It turns out that climate change, for those of you who've seen the Al Gore movie or been reading on this subject, you know that climate change, global warming, is an incredibly important subject. If the global warming happens as much as the recent Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change says it will this century, it's going to have enormous impacts on American agriculture, forestry, horticulture. It's going to mean rising sea levels, which are going to be flooding coastal areas. It's going to result in higher temperatures, which are going to harm people's ability to survive during the summertime. It's going to result in movement of diseases further north into the United States, like malaria, dengue fever, and Lyme disease. It's going to have enormous economic, political, and social implications for the United States. And of all of these changes which are going to occur in the landscape, the first sign that we're going to see is the effects on flowering time and bird migration times. That these are the most sensitive indicators that we have of the effects of climate change. All these other ones are going to happen. They're just going to happen a little bit later. So if we can start seeing the effects on the flowering time of plants and on the bird arrival times, it's an indication that things are changing and that worse things are going to be happening in the future. So it's not that we are concerned about flowering time, especially we're botanists, so we're very interested in when plants flower, but it's also a window into these other more serious consequences which are going to occur in the coming years. And of all the people that we've encountered, all the records, Thoreau really maintained itself, Thoreau's records, as really the best records, the most detailed records, and also the ones that have the greatest quotes with it. So Thoreau was not only keeping records, but he was writing about why he was doing it. He was writing about the seasons. And when you read Thoreau, you really just get a feeling for appreciation for nature. And so here's a quote from Thoreau before he went to Walden. He said, "I want to go away soon and live away by the pond, but my friends ask what I will do when I get there. Will it not be employment enough to watch the progress of the seasons?" So Thoreau was very interested in looking at the progress of the seasons, and he made very detailed calendars. It turned out he didn't make these detailed calendars when he was at Walden, but he started keeping them in the 1850s during his walks around Walden and elsewhere around Concord. And this is a picture from Sleepy Hollow Cemetery, for those of you who know Concord. So these are bluets right here. And right now, if you go to this particular spot where they have these 3 gravestones and this kind of one little slope here, if you went there right now, there'd be only a couple of bluet flowers. But if you go to this place in about a week's time, it'll be covered by bluets. And then in about another week after that, there'll be no more bluets. So bluets can really kind of identify the onset of the spring and a particular week of the spring very dramatically. And Boston is a great place to do climate change research because the temperature has increased so dramatically in the Boston area since the 1850s, since Thoreau's time. And so this is a graph here of average temperature in degrees centigrade from 1850, when Thoreau started keeping his records, to the present time. And you can see very unambiguously that the temperatures have been getting warmer in Boston. Temperatures are extremely variable in Boston, we know that, but the overall trend is toward a warming temperature, and it's unambiguous. It's been about a 2-degree centigrade rise in the temperature of Boston, but most of this rise is not due to global warming, it's due to urbanization. So Boston, as it's had more roads and parking lots and buildings, these absorb the heat of the sun during the day and give off the heat in the evening. And so it keeps the city warmer, the metropolitan area warmer, as a result of urbanization. The rest of the country is warmed by about 0.6 degrees centigrade, so still measurable, but big cities like Boston, New York, and Chicago have risen more because of both global warming and the regional warming associated with urbanization. So cities are actually very good places to study the effects of warming because Boston has warmed as much in the last 150 years as the rest of the country will warm in the coming 100 years. So the rest of the country will warm by about another 1.5 degrees in the coming 100 years. So what we see in Boston today tells us what will happen in the rest of the United States in the coming century. And what you can see in Boston is we've had this 2 degrees warming. I also want to point out these years right around the 1860s. So these were the coldest years of all that we've had in Boston's history, and we'll come back to these years in the 1860s in a few minutes. So what we began to do is to track the flowering times of plants in Concord, and we had Thoreau's records from the 1850s. So Thoreau looked at the flowering time of about 500 plant species in Concord in the 1850s. We then found another botanist named Hosmer, who in the 1880s and 1890s, from 1888 to 1902, Hosmer went around Concord and recorded the flowering times of over 700 plant species in Concord, kept them in beautiful bookkeeper's notebooks, and never wrote a word about why he was doing it. And at the end of his life, he deposited his notebooks in the Concord Public Library, where they sat for 102 years until we started looking at them in 2004. So it was an amazing resource to uncover, especially he had observed the same plants that Thoreau did in the same places. And so these are some of the plants that we looked at, Rhodora or the bird's foot violet, and again, we looked at about 700 other plant species in Concord, about 500 other plant species in Concord that they looked at. I'd like to point out that this work was done with lots of undergraduates, some of whom are here tonight. So these are 2 undergraduates, Ellen Reed and Sharda Mukunda, who work with us for many field seasons, and there are other undergraduates who also worked in the field with us. It shows them looking at pink lady slipper orchids right here. And so we would go out starting in the beginning of April through the end of August, and we would go out several times a week, wandering all around Concord, places like Walden Pond, Estabrook Woods, Sleepy Hollow Cemetery, and recording the first flowering of the plant species and also when they finished flowering, and trying to accumulate the same kind of data that Thoreau did. And this is the results. This is a summary of 4 years of incredibly hard work by Abe Miller Rushing and many undergraduates. And this is a summary of just so much data and so much work. It's kind of hard to believe just looking at it that it's so simple looking. But this is a graph showing the 1850s of Thoreau's observations, also shown in yellow. These are the 1880s and 1890s. The red dots are all observations made by Hosmer. And then the blue dots are observations made by Abe Miller Rushing, myself, and the undergraduates who worked with us. And each one of these dots here represents the average of 40 common wildflower species, like highbush blueberry and marsh marigold, that Thoreau, Hosmer, and we saw in every one of our years of observation. So they're species that we all saw in every year. They were always common species, and we all saw them in every year. And these bars here represent the average of all of a particular observer's years. So this is the average of all of Thoreau's averages. And so you can see that in in Thoreau's years that on average these species flowered on May 16th, and there's a lot of variation. So these years the plants tended to flower very early. This was a very late year, but on average they flowered on May 16th. In Hosmer's years, they flowered on the average about May 12th, and in our years they flowered on about May 8th. So you can see there's this progressive earlier flowering of about 8 days over this 150-year period. So dramatic shift in the flowering dates, which we can see by looking at these 40 species. And one of the challenges also of this was reconciling all the names, making sure that our names were the same as Hosmer's names and the same as Thoreau's names, because people use different names in different historical periods, different scientific names, and just trying to figure this out was a great challenge. So the plants are flowering earlier, but why are they flowering earlier? And it turns out it's abundantly clear with the plants that we have in this region here that plants flower earlier in the spring because of temperature. And so each one of these dots here represents all those plant species that flower in a particular year in relationship to the temperature in January, April, and May of a particular year. So we found that January, April, and May temperatures are very important in determining flowering time. So it's in a very cold year, the plants tend to flower late. And when it's a very warm year, for example, 7 degrees centigrade, the plants tend to flower very, very early. The blue dots here are the native species of Concord, and the yellow dots are the non-native species, the exotic plant species, the species which have been introduced into Concord. And you can see that both for the non-native species and the native species, the slopes are the same. So in both groups of plants, when it's a warm year, they flower very early, and when it's a very cold year, they flower very, very late. So it's really temperature which is driving this. Not that the plants are flowering earlier because they're just flowering earlier every year. They're not doing it just because it's one year after another. They're flowering earlier now than in Thoreau's time because it's warmer now than in Thoreau's time. They're responding to temperature. And this is a graph showing which months are the most important in affecting the flowering time of these plants. And as you expect, the months of April and May are extremely important in determining the flowering plants of our spring flowering species in the Boston area. So when it's a warm April and May, plants flower earlier. I think that this is something that most of us intuitively understand if we do a lot of gardening or spend a lot of time outside. But what was surprising was that the January temperature was also extremely important. So the colder the January, the later the plants flower that year, and the warmer the January, then the earlier plants flower. And as a native Bostonian, of course, that makes sense to me, because I know we have really cold winters, and if it's a mild winter, the plants will, of course, flower earlier. But it turns out that this isn't what the literature says, because most of the literature on the timing of plant flowering, what's called phenology, is written by British scientists. And in Britain, it's exactly the opposite, because in Britain, the winters are very mild, and the plants need a certain number of cold days before they flower in Britain. So if it's a very mild winter in Britain, the plants actually flower late. And if it's a very cold winter in Britain, the plants get those number of cold days more quickly, and they actually flower earlier in Britain when it's a very cold winter. And that's just an illustration of why we need studies in Massachusetts, because the situation here is very different from other parts of the country or other parts of the world. Also, during the last 5 years, Abe Miller-Rushing and various undergraduates who've been working with us have been searching for new sources of data to tell the story of climate change. And we're always looking for more dramatic ways of telling the impacts of global warming. And one of the very dramatic pieces of evidence we found for the effects of global warming was using museum specimens collected in the past to see when species were active. And at the Arnold Arboretum in Jamaica Plain, right nearby here, they have, of course, thousands of living plants growing on the grounds. But what we didn't know until after a couple of years of working there was that they also had a huge museum of herbarium specimens. Herbarium specimens are plants which are clipped from a living plant, a branch clipped from a living plant, dried and pressed flat, and then mounted on a sheet. And the label shows not only what the plant was, but what the data was collected, but what was also amazing, what we discovered to our astonishment when we started working at the Arnold Arboretum, was that they also say the number of the plant. So you can look at this specimen and you can see what the number of the plant is, and you can find the exact same plant living on the grounds today. So this plant right here was a herbarium specimen collected on May 19th, 1938, and this is the same plant right here was collected from, flowering on May 11th, 2004. And so for hundreds of specimens living on the grounds, of living plants on the ground, we found herbarium specimens that had been collected over the last 120 years at the Arnold Arboretum. And by matching these for hundreds of specimens, we could determine that the plants at the Arnold Arboretum are now flowering about 11 days earlier than they were 100 years ago. So this was a very dramatic way also of illustrating the effects of global warming, and also doing it in a way which was innovative, so using herbarium specimens rather than direct observations, and also doing it in a way which was very attractive. So we were always very interested to take pictures like this of us standing with props in front of plants flowering very actively. We would sometimes take the pictures ourselves, or we would call up the BU Public Relations Department and tell them to send out a photographer. And it's pictures like these which also help to have our study get a lot more impact, because whenever we would do a story, we would have photographs like this, which we were able to distribute to the media. So hopefully the next slide will come up. So it's actually, I think, a little bit of a different approach. Let me just try. Okay, here we go. Okay, so another resource which we also discovered after museum specimens was we decided that we would look for collections of photographs also as a way of telling the story of climate change. And we knew that in Boston there were places where we could find old collections of photographs. And one of these places was at the Concord Public Library. Another place was at the Arnold Arboretum. But we knew that there was a collection of photographs at the Concord Public Library taken by the famous landscape photographer Gleason. And Gleason mostly took photographs of the gardens of wealthy people in the Boston area or eastern United States, but he also was in love with Thoreau, and he went all around Concord in the 1920s, and he tried, or 19 teens and 20s, and he tried to rephotograph all of the plants mentioned by Thoreau in his journals and all of the places. And so we looked at his collection, and his photographs were dated. And so we were able to look at his collection of photographs. Like, for example, this black and white photograph of a pink lady slipper orchid taken on June 22nd, 1917, and we could match it with when we saw these same plants flowering in Concord today. And if you go to Concord today, you can find a pink lady slipper orchid flowering on June 22nd. They're all finished flowering. And so if we presume that these plants were taken when the plants were in peak flowering or just before they were in peak flowering in really perfect condition, we can see also that the plants in Concord are now flowering earlier using these photographs. So it's another way of telling the same story. And now we come to our most dramatic pair of photographs of all. So while we were doing this study, we were working at the Mount Auburn Cemetery, and one of the officers who worked at the cemetery told us that she had a really strange photograph. Since we were interested in the effects of climate change, she had a really strange photograph that she'd like to share with us. And her hobby was collecting photographs of cemeteries, historical photographs of cemeteries. And she said this one was a really strange picture. Of all the pictures she'd had taken on Memorial Day, this was a photograph which looked really odd. And if you look at this photograph, something looks really strange about it. This picture from the Lowell Cemetery. And the reason it looks so strange is because the trees don't have any leaves on them. And also, of course, the people are wearing kind of heavy jackets and cloaks. So this was a photograph taken in 1868 on Memorial Day, May 30th, 1868, and the trees don't have any leaves on them yet. And when you go to this same exact spot today on Memorial Day, so if you see the steps here and the various walls, this gravestone here is the same one as right here. So you go to this exact same spot. The trees, of course, have leaves on May 30th. And if you remember from that earlier image I showed you, that the late 1860s, were the coldest period that Boston has experienced in the last 150 years. And so this explains why these trees don't have any leaves. It's just a dramatic example of the effects of climatic variation on biological systems. We're going to be experiencing extreme warmth, but this was the effect of extreme cold on natural systems. Actually, one thing which was interesting, this was mentioned in this Associated Press article which appeared recently, and now with the internet, there was a whole community of people on the Mass Bird Serve. There's a special website for bird watchers, and there was a whole group of people who decided that this was incorrect, that they decided that this was a false story, and a whole group of people set out to prove that this was not taken in 1868, that this was not done on Memorial Day, that there was some other thing happening with this. And they went to the Lowell Cemetery, they looked at weather records, and I was sitting there nervously while all these people were trying to disprove these pictures, but in fact, this was taken on Memorial Day, 1868. The one thing which we don't know is it's possible that the trees have leafed out, but they may have been killed by a frost after they were leafed out. So that's one thing which we still don't know. We've also been searching for bird data. And so we've been working with a whole variety of ornithologists in Massachusetts to look at the effects of climate change and warming on the bird arrival times in the spring. So we've been looking for bird data. We're trying to determine whether birds are responding to climate change and if their response is similar to the plants. And this shows an intern at Manamet Bird Observatory taking a catbird out of a mist net. And so we found a lot of data using diaries of ornithologists. There's lots of ornithologists in Massachusetts who keep diaries. There's a whole group of ornithologists at Mount Auburn Cemetery who compete to see who can see the first bird of each species in the spring. And then there's a very elaborate bird observatory on the south shore of Massachusetts near Plymouth, where they have over 35 years of records of arrival of migratory birds. And at least for some bird species, the arrival time is dramatically earlier. So for wood ducks, for example, from 1970 onward, the birds have changed their arrival time from arriving in April to arriving in early March or even February. So wood ducks have really shifted their migration time a lot. And now with new graduate students and various undergraduates, we've actually discovered that Thoreau also kept a diary of when birds arrived in Concord. So we're actually working with Concord naturalists to try to look at the changing pattern of bird arrival times in Concord. So now I've shown you a lot of information about the fact that plants are flowering earlier, birds are arriving earlier, what we found, what we haven't found. You just think, okay, I'm convinced. So what? So again, the emphasis is that it's interesting from a naturalist perspective that plants are flowering earlier and that birds are arriving early. But again, the thing which we have to emphasize is this is an indication of other changes which have even greater human impact. So it indicates that the hay fever seasons are going to be earlier, that Lyme-infected ticks are going to be active earlier in the spring, that it's going to get hotter in the summer and certain heat-sensitive plants are going to be dying in the summer, that a lot of the wetlands are going to be drying out in the summer because of warmer weather. So these are just an indicator of what's happening. It's also an indicator of what ecologists call mismatches. And a mismatch is a mismatch in timing between closely related species, or species which are closely related in terms of their natural history. And so, for example, if you look at the English oak is flowering in Europe, in Northern Europe is flowering about 2 weeks earlier than it did 30 years ago. So it's leafing out earlier. The English oak is leafing out earlier. The winter moth caterpillar, which is now in Massachusetts, is also emerging about 2 weeks earlier and finishes its life cycle 2 weeks earlier. And the winter moth caterpillar is the main food source of the pied flycatcher, which migrates into this region from North Africa. But the pied flycatcher is arriving at the same time in Northern Europe, and it's not being affected by temperature at all. And so by the time it mates, lays its nest, hatches the eggs, and starts feeding its nestlings, the winter moth populations are already declining. The caterpillars aren't there anymore, and the nestlings are starving. So the pied flycatcher populations are declining in Europe because it's not tracking the caterpillar populations. And this is the thing that ecologists are concerned with, and they're looking for right now is potential mismatches in the timing of species. And we may see examples of mismatches in the Boston area. So what we find is that the plants are shifting quite dramatically in their flowering times, about 3 days for every 1 degree increase in temperature. We don't know about the insects, but the birds which are arriving in Massachusetts are feeding on the insects, which are probably tied into when the plants are flowering. And the short distance migrants, the species that are overwintering in the southeast United States, for example, they're changing only about 1.3 days earlier for every 1 degree increase in temperature. And the long distance migrants, which are coming in from South America, the flycatchers and some of the warblers, they're not changing their arrival time at all. It doesn't matter what the temperature is. It doesn't matter from Thoreau's time to the present time. They don't seem to be changing their arrival time. And so they may be not tracking the temperature very effectively. And they may be left out if the climate changes. I'd also like to mention that in my sabbatical in Japan, I moved into some new directions on this subject. So in Japan, they actually have an incredible wealth of information about the timing events kept by the Japanese Meteorological Service. So that in Japan, there are records that have been kept of over 100 phenological events, 100 timing events kept at 100 weather stations around Japan since the 1950s. And these same species have also been monitored in Japan at 80 stations. And this was a data set which had been unanalyzed. And when I was in Japan, I started working with colleagues to analyze this data set. And this is the kind of thing that gets ecologists very excited, because we looked at when the Yoshino cherry, the very common dramatic Japanese cherry, flowers in Japan in relationship to the temperature in the spring. And so this shows when it flowers in the year. So this is very early in the year, and this is very late in the year. And so we have 180 weather stations in Japan and South Korea where the Yoshino cherry has been tracked for the last 50 years. So this is like 9,000 data points here. The blue ones are South Korea, and the red ones are Japan. And we've been building these models of how temperature affects the flowering time of plants, of cherries in Japan and South Korea. And then we've been using these models of different species to see how a whole group of species will behave at a particular site. So for example, if you just look at this site of Totori in Japan, each one of these lines here shows how a particular species in Japan will be responding to temperature. And this line right here shows what the temperature is at the present time at that place. And this shaded area shows what the temperature will be like in the coming 100 years based on climate change projections. And the important point here to realize is that over the next 100 years, as conditions get warmer, that these group of 6 species are going to be changing at different rates. Some of them are going to be actually active earlier in the spring, some aren't going to be changing much, and some are going to be happening earlier. So it's possible they really come out of alignment. And this is something which people in Japan are now very concerned with. So where do we go from here? So what Abe and I started to do last year was to organize a citizen science component to our work. We started to involve people in New England making observations of plants and birds in the Boston area. But just after we got started with this, a national initiative started, which is called Project Budburst. So we decided to let the national movement really kind of take over this regional project that we started. We sort of handed them all of our information. And also, one thing which made what Abe and I and our students did, which was different from a lot of other scientists did, is that we very actively work with science journalists to try to spread our story as widely as possible. So we often contacted journalists. We wrote press releases ourselves. And we also tried to write about our work for popular journals. So we tried to spread the message of climate change as widely as possible. At this point, it would be kind of easy to end this talk, but there's one very important little twist to our talk which I think is worth mentioning. And that's whenever you do field work, you always see something really unusual that you didn't expect. So when you're out wandering around Concord 2 times a day, 2 times a week for 4 years, you're bound to see something which is a little unusual. And what we observed was something that Thoreau started to comment on, which was the loss of species in Concord. And so one of Thoreau's great quotes is, "I take infinite pains to know all of the phenomena of the spring, thinking I have the entire poem. And then I hear that it is but an imperfect copy that I possess and have read, that my ancestors have torn out many of the first leaves and grandest passages and mutilated it in many places. So Thoreau was lamenting the fact that as he wandered around Concord, that there weren't the wolves and bears and moose and foxes that people had seen in Concord before. And when we wandered around in Concord during these past 5 years, there were also lots of species that we didn't see that Thoreau saw. And this became a very important secondary part of our research. So out of the species that Thoreau saw and mentions in his diary of seeing in Concord, 27% of them we couldn't find in Concord at all. Despite our searching for them very intensively and asking local naturalists, we couldn't find them. And an additional 36% of the species that he mentioned exist only in 1 or 2 populations, which means they're very rare and they're liable to go extinct in the next few years. So probably half the species that Thoreau saw may not be in Concord in future years. And then it appears that most of the losses of species have been only in the last 40 to 50 years because many living or recently deceased naturalists in Concord mention these species. So people, within living memory, many of these species have still been in Concord, but we couldn't find them today. And certain groups are especially vulnerable, like orchids. So Thoreau saw 21 species of orchids in his wanderings, and we've only been able to find 6 of them. So there are certain groups like orchids which are especially vulnerable. And there are more species which are declining than increasing. So sometimes people say, well, kind of, isn't it natural if there's a dynamic? But in fact, overall, the flora is declining. There are more species declining than increasing in abundance. And most of the increasing species are non-native species. And an example of a declining species is the pitcher plant. So if you read all the past accounts of Concord, they always talk about pitcher plant being one of the common plants of Concord, found in all bogs. And today, pitcher plants, as far as we know, are only found in 1 bog in Concord, and even there, it's not very abundant. And all the other bogs where it used to be, we can't find it. So here's a species that Thoreau mentions all the time in his writings, and it's very hard to find it. Again, indicating that if you wandered around in Concord today, trying to have a Thoreauvian experience and kind of connect with his writings through seeing the same plants he did, you couldn't find them today. And this is surprising because more than half of Concord is undeveloped, and about 1/3 of it is actually very well protected in places like Minuteman National Historical Site or Walden Pond Reservation. And so these places are not protecting them because there's been a lot of succession, a lot of forest growing up, a lot of the wildflowers have been shaded out, deers have eaten the plants, invasive species have taken over. A lot of these kinds of changes have eliminated species. And of course, development, so the Emerson Hospital, for example, was built right on Clamshell Bluff, a place where many rare plant species occurred. As I mentioned, we have a lot of species that have come in. So we have 84 new species which have come in that even weren't there 40 years ago in Concord. There's been a lot of turnover. But in contrast to the 84 new species that we found in Concord, for example, the bird's foot trefoil, there are 243 of Thoreau's species that we haven't been able to find. And these species, the rare species in Concord, are mostly concentrated in a few places. So this is a map of Concord. The colored areas are places which are protected lands, so areas where species, if they occurred there, would be very well protected, no development is allowed, and the dots there represent rare species of Concord, species which are only found in 1 place. And what's very striking here is that the rare species are concentrated in a few places, like Walden Pond, which is very well protected, and these are mostly rare native species. But interestingly enough, another concentration of rare species is in the West Concord train station. So this really trashy train station with lots of parking lots and untended lawns and old warehouses. That's a great place for weeds which are invading into Concord. So a botanist's delight, but maybe kind of a naturalist nightmare. So again, a concentration of species. Another interesting place is all along here, all along the Concord River here, where open meadows have been kept. So a lot of rare river meadow species are at that site. And so the point of this slide is to show that the places where we have rare species today are not places which have been left alone and where you have forests growing up. They're mostly open places near rivers, near the edge of lakes, or vacant lots, which are very open and allow wildflower species to compete against trees. And what's really needed in Concord today is not really a hands-off policy. We don't really need people to buy more land and protect more land in Concord. What's really needed in Concord today to really protect the legacy of Thoreau and this kind of living laboratory that we've been working at in these last 5 years is very active management. And this shows, again, kind of a BU undergraduate, Ellen Reed, or former undergraduate, sitting on a stump of a tree at Minuteman National Historical Site. And there was a tremendous uproar when about 3 years ago, Minuteman National Historical Site cut down all the trees along the Concord River on their property to create river meadow. And they wanted to do it to create a landscape which looked like a Revolutionary War landscape. But in fact, by doing this, they opened up the landscape and allowed a lot of river meadow species, like this Canada lily, to start growing up along the river. And so as botanists, we were very happy with this management. So it's just time to conclude. I think I've spoken enough. And these are some of our main concluding points. So we started out 5 years ago wondering whether we could see the signature of climate change in Concord. Was there any evidence that global warming was affecting the plants and birds of Concord? And I think I've convinced you that spring is now occurring earlier. We have lots of evidence of many species, particularly for plants, but also for some bird species, particularly the bird species which are overwintering in the southeastern United States. The natural interactions are almost certainly changing because of the fact that the birds aren't responding to temperature as much as the plants. We're sure that the interactions among the plants and the birds are changing. We don't really know how they're changing, and this is a very active area of study. More changes are going to be coming in Massachusetts and throughout the United States in the coming years as conditions get warmer, as sea levels rise. I see we have some marine biologists in the room tonight, so it's going to be a great topic for marine biologists as the sea level rises and starts to invade a lot of estuaries in Massachusetts. It's going to change the whole ecology of the marine systems. Climate change is just one of the changes in nature, so we should be concerned with global warming, but we should also be concerned with these other issues like succession of the forest, invasive species, deer populations. Management is certainly needed in places like Concord. So Concord is going to be affected by climate change, but it's also going to be affected by just the growing up of the forest. And we also think that the public needs to be involved in this, that climate change is going to have enormous consequences to the United States, economically, socially, and politically. And the American public is still not convinced that it's something we need to take action on. We're focused on a lot of other issues, which are certainly important. So the economy, the war, education, healthcare, they're all important subjects, certainly. But global warming is also a very important subject, and it's certainly a subject which the current administration has not taken very seriously over the last few years. So this is something that the American public really needs to address in coming years. And that there's lots more to do. So certainly, among the general public, people should start keeping calendars of when things flower in their yard. They should start keeping track of the temperature, when the birds arrive, when things are happening around where they live. And that this is something that we all can do, and you can all see within your lifetimes these changes occurring. So in the next few decades, the next years, the next few decades coming, we're all going to see these changes occurring. So it's not too late to start keeping a diary now. You will see changes within the time that you keep your diaries. And now that I'm concluding, again, I'd like to thank the many people who helped me along the way. Most, of course, I'd like to thank Abe Miller-Rushing. All of this is work done that we've done jointly together over these last few years. He's been a real partner in all these projects. I'd like to thank, I should start off by thanking Boston University for providing a place where all this research could happen and providing some of the funding for this research. But there are a number of other funding agencies and institutions which hosted myself and our group during this time. And I'd especially like to thank all of these people here. All the people listed here are co-authors on these various publications, coming out of this project. And all the people with stars on their names are actually Boston University undergraduates who are co-authors on various publications. So Abe and I often talk about the fact that we were so lucky that we encountered such an enthusiastic and capable group of undergraduates in this project. They made it kind of a joy to interact with during this study. And I really mean that. It was really fun talking to them, kind of interacting with them, sharing lunch with them when we were out in the field, and talking about these projects. And then it was sort of, I think, very exciting for them to be included as co-authors on these resulting publications. But it was only appropriate because we couldn't have done the work without their help. And with that, I'll conclude. And thank you very much for your attention. And I think we have time for questions. Thank you very much. Yes, okay, yes, back there. We're going to start anywhere? Yes? We're going to wait for the microphone. I've actually been very sternly warned that we should always wait for the microphone.
I just have one question, or actually an observation about the plant species that are no longer in Concord that were there during Thoreau's time. Now, those plant species probably weren't there 150 or 200 years earlier because it was forest. So some of that is just natural changes in the way we've used the land. Of course, that's tangential to the rest of the stuff you're talking about.
Well, I agree that Concord has constantly been changing. So during Thoreau's time, that was really at the peak. Actually, it was just slightly past the peak of agriculture. So agriculture was starting to decline. Logging was starting to decline. So it was probably a good time to be looking at wildflowers in Concord because the area was relatively open, and yet it was not being intensively used in many cases. During the time when Europeans first arrived here, still Concord actually had quite a lot of open land because the Native Americans were apparently burning along the river meadows to create open areas for grazing by deer, for hunting. So Concord has always been in flux, and it may, in fact, it certainly has a lot more forest than Thoreau's time, and in the future, the changes are going to be occurring. So it's always been in flux. But, I think that our goal, and certainly the goal of a lot of people in Concord, has been trying to preserve the way it was during Thoreau's time. Though, of course, all of the Minuteman Historical Society, the Minuteman National Historical Site, their goal is to preserve the landscape the way it was during the time of the Revolutionary War. So we all have slightly different objectives, and it keeps changing. That's certainly true.
Thank you. I wonder if you've looked at the information with regard to when there were various emissions,
Various what?
like car emissions.
Oh.
Development, what people have done to have emissions in the air. And then also I've heard people say, well, Al Gore says this, that, and the other thing, but we had the ice age and the earth gets warmer and colder anyway. So I wondered if you've thought about these things in relationship to the information you found. Thank you.
So I'm not sure, is your question, whether global warming is real or not, or how it's going to be affecting Concord? Well, certainly global warming is real. Hopefully people here believe that. Thousands of the top climatologists and meteorologists and biologists have met for decades to review all the evidence. I think it's very clear that global warming is happening, and what we can see in Concord is the effects of warming already on one place. And what would be very worth monitoring in a place like Concord is to start monitoring a lot of the wetlands. I think that's one of the places where we're going to see a lot of the effects of climate change on a particular group of species. So in Concord, there's only a few places where they have spotted salamanders, for example, or certain wetland species, and those species may no longer be present in coming decades if those wetlands start drying out in the summer. So that's the kind of place where I would be looking for evidence of this. But it's very clear from all the evidence that climate change is happening, not just in big cities, but also in remote areas of the world like the Antarctic or places like Mount Kilimanjaro.
We talk about, we talk about warming, but do you think there's a political will on behalf of us to cluster zoning, less intensive use of automobiles, and more mass transit? You know, are people ready, willing, and even able to make the significant changes in the lifestyle that are required to reverse these, or even slow these trends?
Well, I think that we could make enormous reductions in our greenhouse gases as a country, but it just requires political will or economic controls on the population. So we can change, but Americans respond to economic signals, and we respond to the government. And so if gas is relatively inexpensive and there isn't a social stigma to it, then people will buy big cars and drive a lot and live in big houses. But if suddenly there's a tax on big houses, there's a tax on energy inefficient appliances, there are taxes on big cars, if fuel prices start getting higher, then people will respond to those signals. And there's some evidence that it's starting to happen right now in the United States, that people are starting to buy smaller cars or drive less. But what if gas went from $3 a gallon to $6 a gallon, like in Europe, or $8 a gallon? Then people would respond to it. So I think that what we really need in this country is either very, very strong government incentives to change or a price structure which would cause people to change, because people aren't going to do it unless that's there. And it requires a government, either a government that forces us to do it or such an energy crisis that the price goes up and then people will start to change. So it's very hard to imagine people doing it in the United States just because they think of global warming happening at some time in the future. It's happening in other countries. So in European countries or Japan, people are very conscious of global warming, but it still hasn't happened in the United States.
Excuse me, do you have a theory concerning the demise of the honeybee? Do you feel that this is related to climate change?
Okay, actually, the person who said that raised their hand. I didn't see that person. Oh, but the honeybees are caused by climate change. Yeah, the honeybees have been declining, across the United States, and I think there's a lot of, potential reasons why this is occurring. And you probably, if you've asked the question, you probably know some of them. I think the best evidence is really that it's probably caused by a fungus or a mite. So I think that that's really what people think is causing it, or people really aren't sure. It doesn't, as far as I know, it's not particularly related to temperature. So it's not, I don't think that people suspect that it really happens because of warmer years. Though in warmer years, the colonies are under more stress. So the beekeepers do have to feed their bees during the wintertime if it's not particularly cold. But that doesn't explain the dramatic decline in honeybees around the country. So it's probably these other sort of introduced pest species.
I have a question. It's obvious from your research that spring is coming sooner, or it's warmer and things are blooming and there's changes in bird migrations. What about the other end of the warm season? Is there any information or research being done that the season is actually longer and what that implication might be?
That's right. That's a very good question. There tends to be the most information available for the spring because that's when you have these sudden flowerings and birds arriving. But when people have looked at the end of the season, they've also found that the growing season is extending. So there's also usually a later fall. We've had much later falls than in the past. If you look at long-term records, the growing season is lengthened. The ripening of fruit, of course, the ripening of fruit is moving earlier because the ripening of fruit is tied in with when the plants flower in the spring. But the coloring of leaves is later, has tended to be later than it was in the past, where we have records for that. And the timing of bird migration is quite variable depending on whether the birds are having one clutch of eggs or two clutches of eggs. So there it's a kind of a much more of a mixed pattern. So the birds probably aren't staying around except for some of the waterfowl which migrate in relationship to temperature. So I think that that's really what the evidence is suggesting so far.
I know there were really only 3 data sets for your Hosmer and Thoreau and yours, but I was surprised to see that the change between Thoreau's time and Hosmer's time, which was shorter, in time seem to be as great as between Hosmer and now. Can you
Right.
comment on that?
Yeah, that's something that we often feel very lucky about. So we've had some bad breaks in our research and some good breaks. And like one of the good breaks was the fact that Hosmer's temperature was right in between Thoreau's and ours. So that's just the luck of those few decades that we happened to get. I think that, I mean, if you look at the temperature curve, the temperatures increased from Thoreau's time to Hosmer's time, and then they kind of stayed steady. They actually kind of dipped a little bit in the 50s and 60s. So those were the times when I was growing up, when the ice was really hard in all the ponds in Newton, where I grew up, and we could go skating on any pond in Newton, whereas my kids haven't been able to skate on the ponds because we've had warmer periods, and the last few decades have been warmer. So I would say that's one of the lucky things about our research. The thing which Abe and I talk about, the fact that we were unlucky, is that we didn't do this research in the late 1990s and early part of this century, because those years from about 1996 to 2002 were incredibly warm. Those were just extraordinary warm springs in Boston, not necessarily warmer globally, but they were extraordinarily warm springs in the Boston area. So if we'd done our research just a little bit earlier, our values would have been off the charts, because the plants would have been flowering weeks or a month earlier, and we would have had this just astonishingly dramatic evidence. But unfortunately, we didn't do that. We didn't. Abe wasn't around. I hadn't thought about doing it, and that was kind of one of the unlucky things. So the years that we worked, which was 2003 through the present time, have been warm years. They've been warmer than in Thoreau's time, warmer than Hosmer's times, but they haven't been these kind of off-the-chart warm years that we had in the Boston area. And I think it was 2001. We had this incredibly warm fall, and in our garden, we were actually harvesting tomatoes through Thanksgiving. So we were harvesting tomatoes through the end of November, which is just, it's unbelievable.
Yes, I wonder if you could comment on what your projects are coming up, if you can share that, what your new research might be, or what your direction you're going in.
Well, one direction, which I mentioned, is with new graduate student Libby Bacon. We're starting to look at the birds of Concord. One thing which was amazing was that we had lots of bird data right from the beginning and lots of plant data from Concord, but we never thought of whether about Thoreau had gathered records from Concord about birds. So we actually only discovered a couple of months ago that Thoreau actually made a detailed bird calendar. So we've now working with lots of people from Concord about birds. Another aspect is that we've started to think about how to test some of these ideas experimentally. So we've made all these correlations between temperature and patterns, but can we actually demonstrate this experimentally? And it turns out that in Waltham, Massachusetts, that the Department of Energy is financing a facility in which temperature will be varied using radiant heaters, above-ground heaters focused on the ground, and also different kinds of roofing and irrigation systems which experimentally increase the amount of rainfall and experimentally decrease the amount of rainfall. So you have all these combinations of temperature and rainfall which will mimic the changing climate of the eastern United States. And so we plan to bring a lot of these same plants that we've studied into this experimental setup, an outside experimental setup, to see how it affects the phenology and the growth of these plants and the survival of these plants in that experimental setup. And then the other area is working in Japan and South Korea. So we've uncovered these incredible sources of information in Japan. I mean, these 50 years of records from 200 stations in these East Asian countries. So we also plan to work with our colleagues from that region. Yes?
Until you responded to a question from back there a few minutes ago, you didn't say anything about potential causes of global warming. And I guess my question is, or not a question, but a comment, isn't that really a political argument? And isn't it possible that global warming that you've been looking at a very short period in time, 150 years or so, is it possible that global warming is really a very long-term natural trend that's just going to continue? I mean, after all, 10,000 years ago, right here where we are sitting, the ice was, what, a mile high, a mile thick?
That's right, that's right.
And isn't it possible that global warming has been going on very gradually for 10,000 years and might continue into the future, no matter what we think about carbon emissions and carbon dioxide and greenhouse gases and all that sort of stuff.
Right. I didn't give very much background information about the causes of global warming because I have kind of assumed that it's been so much in the media, so much has been written about it. People have seen Al Gore's movie, that people understand that it's carbon dioxide emissions and other greenhouse gases which are responsible for the warming. But as to your question, I mean, certainly the global climate is undergoing these long-term fluctuations over the course of centuries and millenniums. It's even undergoing decadal variation in temperature. So that's certainly true. But in addition to the natural variation, that people have been putting out carbon dioxide and greenhouse gases into the atmosphere, which are adding to these natural fluctuations in temperature. That it's possible to estimate how much of the increase in temperature is due to the gases that people have been producing, and this largely accounts for the increase we've seen in the last few decades. So if you take the best climatologists and meteorologists in the world, the best engineers, they have gone through all the calculations, and they have determined that this increase that we're seeing is largely due to the production of greenhouse gases. And I think that the vast majority of scientists in the United States and throughout the world really accept this. It's possible it's wrong, but all the best evidence suggests that this is why we're having this warming temperature today, this unprecedented warming over the last few decades.
Professor Primack, we have time for one more question.
Okay, fine.
Hi, thank you. In your conclusion, you mentioned the idea of habitat management as something that's needed in Concord, and I'm assuming probably you would say throughout some areas in the United States. What did you really envision in the idea of this management, and why did you pick Thoreau's time as your ideal time that we should be striving for?
Well, any management has to have an objective. It has to have a goal or purpose. And a lot of people in Concord are thinking about Thoreau as being the kind of the idyllic time that people are trying for. We're very interested in Thoreau, both because of his writings and because probably that was the time when the flora was most diverse. And I think the goal is to try to maintain the flora like it was in Thoreau's time so that people can, when they read a passage from Thoreau's journals or one of his books, that they can go out and actually see the same species today. That's what I would certainly like to see. But one could pick another time. So certainly some people are managing it for the time of the Revolutionary War. Some people are managing it for the first arrival of the Europeans. In terms of the management required, well, certainly one thing is to remove trees. That certainly a lot of the river meadows have now come up in swamps. And I actually find river meadows to be more appealing aesthetically than swamps. They certainly have a lot more wildflowers than swamps. So that's one example of just removing some of the trees along the river meadows, opening up the views. Another thing is dealing with the deer. So deer have proved to be a huge problem throughout eastern Massachusetts that no solution has really been found for. We had too many deer in this area. In Thoreau's time, there were no deer in Concord. They'd all been hunted out. And now we have an overpopulation of deer. There are too many deers. And some method really needs to be done to control them because they're providing a source for Lyme disease, and they're also grazing down a lot of the wildflowers and munching them into oblivion. So something needs to be done about that. So those are two particular examples of management. Another thought is to remove all the invasive plant species. There was actually one idea of removing every invasive plant species from Concord. Someone proposed of having Concord to be an invasive plant, an invasion-free zone of plants. And a group started on this with great fanfare and removed all the invasive plants from an area about 20 yards by 20 yards, and I think gave up. So that's probably not one which is very feasible. So I guess that's all. Do you have anything else you want to say, Roger, or any announcements?
I think Han would like to say something.
Oh, okay. Please.
Actually, Professor Primack, if you don't stay on stage, please. We just wanted to take this opportunity just to thank Professor Primack for his time tonight in delivering this lecture. Note that We know that your schedule's been very busy, and it's much appreciated that you accommodated us to deliver this great lecture. So on behalf of the Arts and Sciences Alumni Board, just like to present you a small token of our appreciation.